The black water reached her chest, and something was thrashing in the darkness ahead. Not the controlled movement of a soldier navigating terrain. This was panic. This was a man drowning in mud that behaved like a living thing, pulling him down inch by inch while his screams turned to gurgles. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Kikoa raised her rifle above her head with one hand, the other already reaching forward through the muck, and calculated that she had maybe 90 seconds before the bog swallowed him completely. The instructors on the bank were shouting something, but their voices meant nothing now. What they did not know, what nobody at this godforsaken Louisiana training site knew, was that Yolanda Kikoa had been in waters far more dangerous than this. Her grandfather had taught her to hold her breath in Hawaiian caves where the old gods still demanded respect, and respect was exactly what she intended to show this swamp. 36 hours earlier, she had stepped off the transport at Fort Recluse with 23 other candidates, in a duffel bag that contained everything she owned that mattered. The humidity hit like a physical wall. Louisiana in August felt like breathing through a wet towel, and the swamp that surrounded the base seemed to pulse with something ancient and hungry. She was the only woman in this selection class. She had known that before she arrived. What she had not known was how the silence would feel when she walked into the candidate barracks, and 24 male faces turned to assess her like she was a problem that had wandered into the wrong room. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let us know where you are watching from. Maybe you have seen someone face this kind of judgment in your community, or maybe you have faced it yourself. The bunks were arranged in rows, and nobody moved to help her find one. She chose a spot near the back corner, not out of timidity, but because corners meant fewer angles to watch. A young specialist with nervous eyes and skin dark as the bayou mud glanced at her twice before looking away. That was Terrence Okonjo, though she did not know his name yet. Across the room, a sergeant first class with a ranger scroll on his shoulder and the kind of jaw that looked carved from institutional contempt made a sound that might have been a laugh. That was Damon Whitford, and he did not bother hiding his assessment of her chances. She was unpacking her gear when the door opened and the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees despite the heat. Master Sergeant Virgil Stokes walked the way men walk when they have spent 2 decades in places where walking wrong meant dying. 18 years in special operations had carved his face into something that revealed nothing and promised less. His eyes moved across the candidates with practiced efficiency, cataloging, dismissing, calculating. When they reached Kikoa, they stopped. Not long, just long enough for her to understand that she had already been categorized. "Welcome to selection," he said. His voice carried without effort. "Most of you will not finish. That is not a challenge. That is mathematics. This course has a 70% attrition rate, and the swamp does not grade on a curve." He began walking between the bunks, close enough that candidates had to hold themselves still to avoid flinching. "What we do here is simple. We find out who you are when everything else is stripped away. Your rank does not matter here. Your reputation does not matter here. The only thing that matters is whether you can perform when the situation demands performance." He stopped near Kikoa's bunk. She kept her eyes forward, hands continuing to organize her gear as if his presence was nothing more than weather. "Staff Sergeant Kikoa." He said her name like he was tasting something he had not ordered. "You're the first female candidate we have had in 11 months. The last one made it 6 days." She met his eyes then. "6 days is not my concern, Master Sergeant." Something flickered across his face. Not anger. Something more controlled than that. "No," he agreed. "Your concern should be whether you belong here at all." He held her gaze for another moment, then turned and walked toward the door. "Initial assessment begins at 0500. I suggest you all sleep while you can." The door closed behind him, and the room exhaled. Whitford's voice cut through the settling tension. 6 days. He was not talking to anyone in particular, but everyone heard. $20 says she does not make 4. Kikoa did not respond. She finished organizing her gear, checked her equipment twice, and lay down on her bunk while conversations buzzed around her like mosquitoes. She did not sleep. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and thought about her father, about the last time she had seen him before the training accident that took him when she was 12. He had worn the same quiet certainty that she practiced now. The belief that what you were made of mattered more than what anyone expected you to be. Somewhere outside, the swamp made sounds that did not belong to any animal she recognized. Louisiana was going to test her in ways Hawaii never had. But water was water, and mud was just earth that had not made up its mind yet. She had learned to breathe in places where breathing seemed impossible. She would learn to breathe here too. The next morning came with a whistle that split the darkness at 0430. Candidates scrambled into formation while the sky was still black and the air was thick enough to chew. Master Sergeant Stokes stood before them like a monument to everything they were supposed to become. Today, he announced, we find out if any of you know how to swim. His eyes found Kikoa in the formation. Some of you might want to reconsider right now, he said. No shame in knowing your limits before the swamp teaches them to you. She did not blink. She did not look away. And somewhere in the darkness behind Stokes, the swamp waited to see what she was made of. The water confidence test was designed to break minds before it broke bodies. Kikoa understood this the moment she saw the setup. A concrete pool had been built into the swamp itself, fed by the same black water that surrounded the base. The surface was still and dark, and revealed nothing of what waited beneath. Candidates would enter one at a time, submerge completely, and navigate an underwater obstacle course while instructors did everything in their power to induce panic. The ones who surfaced before completing the course were done. The ones who panicked and had to be pulled out were done. The ones who completed it got to do it again tomorrow with less air. Whitford went third. He emerged gasping but triumphant, water streaming from his face like war paint. His eyes found Kikoa in the line of waiting candidates, and he smiled the way men smile when they think they have already won something. Okonjo went seventh. He stood at the edge of the pool for too long, his chest rising and falling too fast, his hands clenched at his sides. Kikoa watched him and recognized what she saw. This was not weakness. This was a man fighting a battle with something that lived inside his own head. He entered the water and did not come up for 90 seconds. When he finally surfaced, he had completed the course, but barely. His eyes were wild, and his breath came in ragged bursts that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Master Sergeant Stokes made a note on his clipboard and did not look up. Kikoa went 15th. She walked to the edge of the pool and looked down into water that wanted her to be afraid. The instructors were watching. The other candidates were watching. Stokes was watching with that particular attention he seemed to reserve only for her. She thought about the caves in Hawaii where her grandfather had taken her when she was 9 years old. Dark water, no light, no guarantee of air, just the understanding that fear was information, not instruction. She entered the pool without hesitation. The water closed over her head, and the world became darkness and pressure and the muffled sounds of her own heartbeat. The obstacles were designed to disorient. Tight passages, false turns, moments where up and down became meaningless concepts. She moved through them the way she had learned to move through underwater caves, with her hands reading the environment and her mind staying 3 moves ahead. When she surfaced, she was not gasping. She was not wild-eyed. She simply pulled herself out of the pool and walked back to the line of candidates, while water dripped from her uniform onto the Louisiana mud. Stokes watched her for a long moment. Then he made a note on his clipboard and called the next name. That evening, the candidates gathered in the barracks with the exhausted silence of people who had survived something together without becoming allies. Kikoa sat on her bunk and checked her equipment for the 3rd time, a habit her father had drilled into her before she was old enough to understand why it mattered. Across the room, she could see Okonjo sitting alone, his hands still trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on something that was not in the room. She crossed the barracks without thinking about whether it was wise. She sat down on the footlocker near his bunk and waited until he looked at her. His eyes were defensive, expecting mockery, expecting the same judgment he had probably received his entire life for being afraid of things that other people pretended not to fear. The trick is not holding your breath, she said quietly. The trick is letting your body remember that it knows how to survive. You were fighting yourself in there. Your lungs had plenty of air. Your mind was the thing trying to drown you. He stared at her like she had spoken in a language he did not recognize. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because tomorrow they're going to make it harder. And you're going to need to know." From across the barracks, Whitford was watching them. His expression had shifted from contempt to something more complicated. Kikoa ignored him. Okonjo was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I grew up in Detroit. The only water I knew was the kind that came out of pipes that were probably poisoning us. When I joined the army, I thought I was escaping something. Now, I'm sitting in a swamp wondering if I escaped anything at all." Kikoa almost smiled. "I grew up surrounded by ocean," she said. "My grandfather used to take me diving in places that would have terrified most adults. He believed that the water was not something to conquer. It was something to understand. The moment you start fighting it, you have already lost." She reached in her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, creased and worn from years of handling. A man in uniform looked back at the camera with eyes that carried both pride and something heavier. "My father," she said. "Special Forces. He died in a training accident when I was 12. Okonjo looked at the photograph and then at her. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it in the way that people mean things when they have known loss themselves. Kikoa tucked the photograph away. "Do not be sorry," she said. "Be ready. Tomorrow is going to be worse." She returned to her bunk and lay down with her back to the room. She did not see Whitford watching her with an expression that had lost some of its certainty. She did not see Okonjo straighten his shoulders like a man who had just been given permission to believe in something. She only saw the ceiling above her and the ghost of her father's face and the understanding that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The next morning, Stokes gathered them before dawn with news that settled over the candidates like the humidity itself. "Today you enter the mire," he announced. His voice carried the weight of something that was not quite threat, but was certainly not comfort. "The mire is where we find out what you are made of. Some of you will not make it through." He paused, and his eyes swept the formation until they found Kikoa. "Some of you might want to reconsider before we begin. There is no shame in knowing your limits." She held his gaze and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The swamp was waiting, and she intended to show it exactly what she was made of. The mire earned its name within the first 100 meters. The ground beneath Kikoa's boots shifted between solid and treacherous with no warning, each step a negotiation with terrain that seemed personally offended by her presence. Cypress trees rose from the black water like the bones of something ancient, their roots creating a maze that swallowed light and sound and confidence. The air was thick with insects and the smell of decay and the particular silence that meant predators were watching. Stokes had divided them into teams of 3. Kikoa found herself assigned to Whitford and Okonjo, a combination that felt less like coincidence and more like a test designed by someone who understood exactly how to create friction. Their route was the longest. Their checkpoints were the most remote. Their timeline was the tightest. She had not expected fairness, but she had cataloged the disparity nonetheless. Whitford took point without asking. His movements were confident and aggressive, the stride of a man who believed that terrain was something to be dominated rather than understood. Okonjo followed in the middle position, his eyes too wide and his breathing too shallow. Kikoa brought up the rear and watched the swamp the way her grandfather had taught her to watch the ocean. Not as an enemy, as a conversation. They hit the first bog crossing after 40 minutes of navigation. The water stretched before them like a wound in the earth, still and dark, and offering no indication of depth. Whitford studied it for approximately 3 seconds before stepping forward. "Wait." Kikoa's voice stopped him at the edge. He turned with irritation already forming on his face. "This water is wrong," she said. "The surface tension, the color. There is something beneath it that is not solid ground." Whitford looked at the crossing and then at her. "We do not have time for caution," he said. "We are already behind the other teams. Being behind is better than being dead." Something flickered in his expression. For a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, he gestured toward the water with exaggerated deference. "Then show us the way, Staff Sergeant, since you apparently speak swamp." She ignored the mockery and moved to the edge of the crossing. Her eyes traced the surface, reading the subtle variations in color and texture that most people never learn to see. There, she pointed to a line that curved along the left edge of the bog. The water is darker because it is shallower. Roots beneath the surface. We follow that line, and we cross without sinking. Whitford stared at the path she had identified. It looked identical to the rest of the crossing. You were guessing, he said. She was already moving. Watch where I step, she called back. And step exactly where I step. The crossing took 12 minutes. 12 minutes of careful foot placement and tested weight distribution, and the constant awareness that one wrong step meant disappearing in a mud that would not let go. Kikoa led them through without incident. When they reached solid ground on the far side, Okonjo let out a breath that he seemed to have been holding since they entered the mire. Whitford said nothing, but he did not take point when they resumed movement. They reached the first checkpoint with 7 minutes to spare. The instructor stationed there marked their time without comment and pointed them toward their next objective. 3 kilometers through the densest section of the mire. Terrain that had broken candidates in previous cycles. Terrain that Stokes had specifically assigned to their team. The second crossing was worse than the first. A section of swamp where the water was waist deep and the bottom was a mixture of mud and roots that grabbed at boots like desperate hands. Okonjo stumbled twice, and Kikoa caught him both times, her grip steady despite the muck that tried to pull them both down. Whitford watched these rescues without comment, but something in his posture had shifted. The contempt was still there, but it was fighting with something else now. Something that looked almost like reassessment. They were halfway through the second crossing when Okonjo's boot was sucked completely off his foot. He stood frozen in the chest-deep water, 1 foot bare, his face a mixture of disbelief and despair. The boot had vanished in a mud that was not interested in returning it. Kikoa looked at Whitford. Whitford looked at the boot-shaped hole in the muck. Then, against every expectation, he laughed. It was not a cruel sound. It was the laugh of a man who had just been reminded that the universe had a sense of humor. "Welcome to Louisiana," he said. "Even a mud is hungry." Okonjo stared at him, then at Kikoa. Then, incredibly, he started laughing too. It was the desperate laughter of someone who had been holding terror inside for too long and needed to release it somehow. Kikoa found herself smiling despite the situation. The 3 of them stood in chest-deep swamp water, 1 boot short of a complete team, laughing at the absurdity of everything they had chosen to do with their lives. Kikoa reached down into the muck. The mud fought her, but she had been fighting water her entire life. Her fingers found leather, and she pulled until the boot emerged with a sound like the swamp was disappointed to lose its prize. She handed it to Okonjo. "Next time tie them tighter," she said. They made the second checkpoint with 2 minutes to spare. The instructor there did not ask about the mud covering them head to toe. He simply marked their time and pointed them forward. Stokes was waiting at the 3rd checkpoint. He stood at the edge of the swamp like something that had grown there, his eyes tracking their approach with an expression that revealed nothing. "You are behind pace," he said when they reached him. "The other teams have already cleared this section." Kikoa met his gaze. "We are still moving, Master Sergeant." He studied her for a long moment. The mud on her uniform, the steadiness in her eyes, the way Whitford and Okonjo had positioned themselves slightly behind her, as if she had become the natural center of their formation without anyone deciding it should be so. "Tomorrow we go deeper," he said finally, "into the section where the ground stops pretending to be solid." He paused, and something that might have been anticipation moved across his face. "I hope your team is ready, Staff Sergeant. The mire does not care about your feelings. It will swallow you whole if you let it." He turned and disappeared into the cypress shadows before she could respond. Okonjo exhaled slowly. Whitford was quiet for a moment. Then he said something that surprised her. "You were right about the first crossing. I would have gone straight through and gotten stuck." It was not an apology. It was not even really an acknowledgement. But from Damon Whitford, it was something close to respect. Kikoa nodded once and turned toward the trail that would lead them back to base. Behind her, the mire settled into silence, patient and hungry, waiting to see what tomorrow would bring. The deeper section of the mire was different. Kikoa felt at the moment they crossed the tree line that separated the training areas from the terrain that had earned whispered warnings around the barracks. The cypress trees grew closer together here, their branches weaving into a canopy that blocked most of the sky. The water was darker. The silence was heavier. Even the insects seemed reluctant to announce their presence. Chief Warrant Officer Ray Delacroix had briefed them before departure. He was a Cajun local who had been navigating these swamps since before most of the candidates were born, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had seen what happened when people disrespected the bayou. "This section has taken equipment," he said. "It has nearly taken lives. The mud here does not behave like mud anywhere else. It will grab you, and it will not let go. You test every step before you commit. You never go in alone. And if you feel yourself sinking, you do not fight. Fighting makes it worse." The words echoed in Kikoa's mind as she led her team through terrain that seemed designed to punish confidence. Whitford had stopped challenging her navigation decisions after yesterday. He moved where she pointed and stepped where she stepped and kept his observations to himself. It was not friendship. It was the practical acknowledgement of a man who had recognized competence and decided that survival mattered more than pride. Okonjo stayed close to her left shoulder. His breathing was steadier today, the panic that had lived in his eyes slowly being replaced by something that looked like focus. During a brief rest, he told her about Detroit, about the neighborhood where gunshots were more common than birdsong, about his mother who had worked 3 jobs to keep him in school, about the recruiter who had promised him a way out and delivered him to a swamp that wanted to swallow him whole. "I thought the Army would be the hardest thing I ever did," he said quietly. "I was wrong. This is harder. But it is also the first time I have felt like I might actually become something." Kikoa understood what he meant. She had felt the same thing when she first qualified for this selection course. The sense that everything before had been preparation for a test that would finally reveal who she really was. They reached a section where the water spread before them like black glass. No visible current. No indication of depth. The checkpoint was on the far side, maybe 60 meters away. Other teams were visible in the distance, taking a longer route that curved around the edge of the still water. Whitford studied the obstacle. "We could go around," he said. "At maybe 20 minutes, but avoid whatever is waiting in there." Kikoa crouched to the water's edge and examined the surface. The color variations she had relied on before were absent here. This water kept its secrets. But there were other signs. The way certain plants grew along specific lines. The subtle differences in how light reflected off sections that were shallow versus deep. She traced a potential path with her eyes and committed it to memory. "We go through," she said, "but we go slow and we go together. If anyone feels the bottom giving way, they call out immediately." The crossing took longer than any before. Each step was a negotiation, a careful probe with one foot while the other maintained purchase on whatever passed for solid ground. Twice Kikoa felt the mud shift beneath her in ways that sent warnings racing up her spine. Both times she adjusted course and guided her team around sections that would have trapped them. They emerged on the far side, covered in mud and breathing hard but intact. The checkpoint instructor marked their time without comment. Stokes was not there, but his presence lingered like humidity. They all knew he was watching from somewhere. The return route took them through a different section of the mire. Night was approaching, and the swamp was transforming into something that felt actively hostile. Sounds emerged from the darkness that did not match any animal Kikoa recognized. The water level had risen slightly, turning paths that had been passable into obstacles that required creative navigation. They made it back to base as the last light faded from the sky. Other teams were already in the barracks, exhausted but present. The attrition had begun. 2 candidates had been pulled from the mire after getting stuck in mud that would not release them. Another had panicked during a water crossing and been evacuated by the medical team. The selection class was shrinking. Kikoa was cleaning her equipment when she noticed something wrong. Her compass, the one she had carried through 3 deployments and trusted with her life, was damaged. The housing was cracked, and the needle moved erratically when she turned it. This was not wear from the day's exercise. This was deliberate. Someone had accessed her gear and broken her most essential navigation tool. She examined the damage carefully, keeping her expression neutral. The crack pattern was consistent with pressure applied to a specific point. Someone who knew exactly how to disable a compass without making it obvious at first glance. Someone who wanted her to discover the sabotage only when she was deep in the mire with no way to navigate. Her father's voice rose from memory, steady and calm the way it had always been when situations turned dangerous. The swamp does not need a compass, Keiki. The swamp tells you where to go if you listen. She set the broken compass aside and lay down on her bunk. Tomorrow's exercise was solo navigation through the worst section of a mire. No team, no support, just her in terrain that had nearly killed people who knew exactly where they were going. Someone on this base wanted her to fail, wanted it badly enough to sabotage her equipment, wanted it badly enough to risk her life. She closed her eyes and thought about black water and patient mud and the understanding that fear was just information. Tomorrow she would navigate without instruments. Tomorrow she would prove that whatever was trying to break her had fundamentally misunderstood what she was made of. She reported the damaged compass at 0400. The instructor on duty examined it with the disinterest of someone who had seen equipment fail before and would see it fail again. These things happen, he said. Louisiana humidity is hard on gear. Kikoa did not argue. She knew what humidity damage looked like, and this was not it. But accusations without proof would only make her look desperate, and desperate was exactly what someone wanted her to be. Stokes appeared as candidates assembled for the solo navigation brief. His eyes found her immediately, tracking to the replacement compass she had been issued. "Equipment trouble, Staff Sergeant," he asked. His voice carried concern that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing I cannot handle, Master Sergeant." He studied her for a moment longer than necessary. Today's exercise is solo navigation through Grid Section 7. That is the deepest part of the mire. No team support, no radio contact except for emergency. You will navigate to 3 checkpoints and return to base before 1700. He paused, and something shifted in his expression. "Given your equipment issues, I would understand if you wanted to withdraw. No shame in recognizing when circumstances are against you." She held his gaze. "I will see you at the finish line, Master Sergeant." The mire swallowed her within minutes of departure. Grid Section 7 was everything Delacroix had warned about and worse. The water was chest-deep in places, the mud beneath it hungry and unpredictable. The cypress trees grew so thick that sunlight became a memory. Navigation by compass alone would have been difficult. Navigation by natural signs required every skill her grandfather had ever taught her. She moved slowly, reading the environment the way she had learned to read Hawaiian currents. Moss growth patterns indicated north. Water flow suggested elevation changes. The behavior of insects revealed where ground was stable and where it was waiting to collapse. It was exhausting work, mentally and physically, but she made progress. First checkpoint reached. Second checkpoint marked. She was navigating toward the third checkpoint when she heard the screaming. The sound cut through the swamp like something being torn. Not the controlled communication of soldiers on exercise. This was panic. Pure animal terror from a human throat. It was coming from somewhere to her east, maybe 200 meters through terrain that did not want to be crossed. Protocol was clear. Mark her position. Continue to the checkpoint. Report the emergency when she reached an instructor. By the time help arrived through proper channels, whoever was screaming would be dead. She turned east and started moving. The scene she found would stay with her for the rest of her life. Whitford was chest deep in mud that was actively pulling him under. His arms were free, but everything below his ribcage had been swallowed by ground that had stopped being solid. Every movement he made only accelerated his descent. 10 meters away, Okonjo was in the same situation. He had clearly tried to help Whitford and gotten trapped himself. His screaming had stopped. His face had gone pale with the resignation of someone who had accepted that they were going to die. Kikoa assessed the situation in seconds. The mud they had fallen into was not regular bog. This was a sinkhole a pocket of earth that had liquefied into something that behaved more like quicksand than swamp. Fighting it would only make them sink faster. The only chance was to spread their weight and slowly work towards solid ground. But they were too deep for that now. They needed an anchor. They needed someone to pull them out. She looked at the terrain between her and the trapped men. The same unstable ground that had swallowed them. If she went in, she might join them. 3 bodies in the mud instead of 2. Her father's face flashed through her mind. He had died because help arrived too late. Because someone had followed protocol instead of following instinct. She had been 12 years old, and she had promised herself that she would never let protocol kill someone she could save. She raised her rifle above her head with her right hand. The weapon would stay dry. The weapon would stay functional. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, she would not be defenseless. Then she stepped into the killing ground. The mud grabbed at her immediately, hungry and eager. She spread her weight across her feet and moved in a sliding motion that her grandfather had taught her for navigating unstable reef. Each step was a calculation. Each movement was a negotiation with terrain that wanted to swallow her whole. Okonjo saw her coming. His eyes went wide with something that might have been hope or might have been horror that she was about to die alongside them. "Staff Sergeant," he gasped. "Do not. You will get stuck." She did not respond. Words were wasted energy. She needed everything she had for what came next. She reached Okonjo first. He was closer and sinking slower. Her left hand found his collar, and she planted her feet against a root system she had identified beneath the surface. The mud fought her. It did not want to release its prize. She pulled anyway, using leverage and technique instead of raw strength, working with the physics of the situation instead of against them. Okonjo came free with a sound like the earth was disappointed. She dragged him towards slightly more stable ground and pointed toward the tree line. "Move," she ordered. "Slow and flat. Spread your weight." He started crawling. She turned toward Whitford. He had sunk deeper in the time it took to free Okonjo. The mud was at his shoulders now. His face was tight with the effort of not panicking, but she could see the terror underneath. The understanding that he was about to die in a Louisiana swamp because he had stepped in the wrong place. She moved toward him with her rifle still raised above the muck. 15 meters of unstable ground between them. The mud pulled at her with every step, trying to claim her the way it was claiming him. She felt herself sinking and adjusted her movement, finding the places where root systems provided just enough stability to keep her from going under. She was 5 meters away when Whitford's head went under. The black water closed over him and he was gone, vanished in a mud that had been waiting for this moment since before humans had a name for Louisiana. Kikoa had maybe 30 seconds before the suction pulled him too deep to reach. She lunged forward without thinking. Thinking would have gotten him killed. Her left hand plunged into the black water where Whitford had disappeared, fingers searching through mud that felt like wet concrete. The suction pulled at her arm, trying to claim her too, but she had anchored her feet against the submerged root, and she was not going anywhere. Her fingers found fabric, his collar. She gripped it with everything she had and pulled. The mud did not want to let go. It had claimed Damon Whitford, and it intended to keep him. Kikoa pulled anyway. She thought about her grandfather teaching her to haul nets from currents that fought back. She thought about her father's hands, strong and certain, lifting her onto his shoulders when she was small. She thought about every moment in her life that had prepared her for this single act of refusing to let the earth swallow someone she could save. Whitford's face broke the surface. His mouth opened in a desperate gasp, sucking air like a man who had already started drowning. His eyes were wild with the primal terror of someone who had felt death's hand around their throat. She kept pulling, kept fighting the mud's grip, kept her rifle raised above the muck with her other hand because some part of her training refused to let go of the weapon even now. She got his shoulders clear, then his chest. The mud released him with a sound like something organic tearing, and suddenly she was dragging him backward through the unstable ground toward where Okonjo had reached the tree line. Her muscles screamed. Her lungs burned. The swamp tried to pull her under with every step. She did not stop. They reached solid ground, and she dropped Whitford onto the muddy bank. He lay there gasping, covered in black muck, alive in a way he had not expected to be 60 seconds earlier. Okonjo was beside him, equally filthy, staring at Kikoa like she had just performed a miracle. She raised her rifle and fired 3 shots into the air, the universal distress signal. Then she sat down in the mud beside the man she had saved and waited for her hands to stop shaking. Delacroix arrived first. He came through the cypress trees with 2 other instructors and a medical team, moving with the urgent efficiency of someone who had seen swamp rescues go wrong. His eyes took in the scene. The 2 mud-covered candidates. The woman sitting between them with a rifle across her knees. The sinkhole that had nearly claimed 3 lives. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he crouched beside Kikoa and spoke quietly. How long were they under before you reached them? Whitford went fully under for maybe 20 seconds. Okonjo never went under. I got to him first. Delacroix looked at the distance between the tree line and the sinkhole. You crossed that ground alone, with no support. No. Yes. He shook his head slowly. The expression on his face was not surprise. It was something closer to recognition, like he was seeing something he had only heard about in stories. That ground has killed people, Staff Sergeant. Experienced people who knew what they were doing. She met his eyes. Then it's a good thing I knew what I was doing. The medical team cleared all 3 of them for continued duty. Bruises and exhaustion and the kind of psychological impact that would not fully register until later, but no injuries that required evacuation. Whitford could not stop looking at Kikoa. His mouth kept opening like he wanted to say something, but the words would not come. They were transported back to base in silence. Stokes was waiting when they arrived. His face was unreadable as the medical team helped Whitford and Okonjo toward the infirmary for observation. His eyes stayed on Kikoa. You abandoned your navigation route, he said. You failed to complete the exercise. She stood before him covered in mud that was still drying on her uniform. 2 men are alive because I abandoned my route, Master Sergeant. That is not how this works, Staff Sergeant. Protocol exists for a reason. You should have marked your position and continued to the checkpoint to report the emergency. By the time help arrived through proper channels, they would have been dead. Something shifted in his expression. The mask he wore so carefully developed a crack she had not seen before. You do not get to make that decision, he said. His voice was harder now. You do not get to decide who lives and dies based on your own judgment. She thought about her father, about the training accident that had killed him while people followed protocol, about the 12-year-old girl who had promised herself she would never let procedure murder someone she could save. With respect, Master Sergeant, someone has to make that decision. Today it was me. He stared at her for a long moment. Then he turned and walked away without another word. Captain Miriam Bassett found her 2 hours later. The female officer who had been assigned to oversee selection fairness protocols had a folder in her hands and an expression that suggested the contents were significant. Staff Sergeant Kikoa, I need to speak with you privately. They walked to a quiet section of the base where the swamp sounds were muffled by distance. Bassett opened the folder and removed a photograph. It showed a compass with a specific crack pattern. Kikoa recognized it immediately. Your damaged equipment, Bassett said. I had it examined by someone who knows what deliberate sabotage looks like. She paused and her eyes met Kikoa's. This was not humidity damage. This was not accident. Someone broke your compass intentionally. Kikoa had known this already. Hearing it confirmed still sent ice through her chest. There is more, Bassett continued. I have been documenting patterns in this selection course for 18 months. You are not the first female candidate to experience equipment failures under Master Sergeant Stokes. You are the fourth. The fourth. The other 3 washed out, Bassett said, after their equipment failed, after safety concerns were raised about their performance, after they were encouraged to withdraw for their own good. She closed the folder. What you did today saved 2 lives. But what you do next might save every woman who comes after you. Kikoa looked toward the swamp. Somewhere out, there was the sinkhole that had nearly killed Whitford and Okonjo. Somewhere on this base was a man who had tried to sabotage her and might have contributed to the deaths of the candidates she had just saved. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Bassett's answer was simple: the truth, and the courage to tell it. Whitford found her that evening. She was sitting on an equipment crate behind the barracks, watching the sun bleed into the swamp and trying to process everything that had happened in the past 12 hours. He approached like a man walking towards something he did not entirely understand, his movements hesitant in a way she had never seen from him before. He sat down on a crate beside her without asking permission. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The swamp filled the silence with its chorus of insects and distant splashes and the breathing of something ancient that had been here long before humans decided to test themselves against it. "I have been doing this for 9 years, Whitford finally said. His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "Ranger school, multiple deployments. I have been in situations that should have killed me." He paused, and she could see him struggling with something that did not come naturally. "Today was the first time I actually thought I was going to die." Kikoa did not respond. Some moments required listening more than speaking. "When I went under," he continued, "when the mud closed over my head and I could not breathe, I thought about my daughter. She is 4 years old. I have missed 2 of her birthdays because of deployments. I was sinking into that swamp, thinking about how I was going to miss all the rest of them, how she was going to grow up without a father because I stepped in the wrong place." His hand was shaking slightly. He noticed and pressed them flat against his thighs. "Then you pulled me out." He turned to look at her directly for the first time. "I have been treating you like you did not belong here since the moment you arrived. I thought you were a quota, a publicity stunt, something the Army was doing to check a box." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong. I was wrong about all of it." Kikoa met his eyes. She saw something there that had not existed 2 days ago. Not gratitude, though that was present too. Something deeper. The recognition of one soldier seeing another clearly for the first time. "You would have done the same thing," she said. He shook his head. "I do not know if I would have. That ground should have killed all 3 of us. You came in anyway, with your rifle raised like you were clearing a room instead of walking into a death trap." He almost smiled. "That was the most insane thing I have ever seen anyone do. And the bravest." They sat in silence again. The sun had nearly finished its descent, and the swamp was transforming into its nighttime self, darker and louder and somehow more alive. Whitford spoke again. "I heard about your compass, about the investigation." He hesitated. "I have seen Stokes do things over the years. Small things. Things that seemed like coincidence at the time. I never said anything because I thought maybe I was imagining it." "You were not imagining it." "No." He exhaled slowly. "I do not think I was. If they need someone to testify about what I have seen, I will do it. Is the least I owe you." Okonjo appeared around the corner of the barracks. He moved toward them with the careful steps of someone still processing trauma, but his eyes were clearer than they had been since the swamp. He sat down on the ground near their crates and pulled his knees to his chest. "I called my mother," he said. "Told her what happened. She cried for 20 minutes. Then she told me to find you and say thank you." He looked at Kikoa with an expression that held no complexity, no calculation. Just simple, honest gratitude. "Thank you. For my life. For the chance to go home and see her again." Kikoa felt something shift in her chest. The weight she had been carrying since the rescue, the adrenaline crash and the emotional aftermath, eased slightly in the presence of these 2 men who had become something more than fellow candidates. "We are a team now," she said, "not because they assigned us together, because we went through something together that changes things." Whitford nodded. Okonjo wiped his eyes and nodded too. The door to the barracks opened and Delacroix stepped out. He walked toward them without hurry, his Cajun features illuminated by the last light of the dying sun. He had something in his hands, a thermos and 3 metal cups. "Thought you might need this," he said. He poured dark coffee into each cup and handed them out. "Best thing for shock is hot liquid and company." He settled onto an empty crate and looked out of the swamp. "I have been working this base for 15 years. I have seen a lot of candidates come through." He sipped his coffee. "I have never seen anyone do what you did today, Staff Sergeant." Kikoa wrapped her hands around the warm cup. "I did what had to be done." Delacroix shook his head. No, you did what you chose to do. That is different. Protocol said mark the position and continue. Following orders said leave them and report. You chose to go into that ground knowing it might kill you. He looked at her with eyes that had seen too much to be easily impressed. That is not duty. That is something else. The four of them sat together as darkness claimed the swamp. Somewhere in the distance, an alligator bellowed its presence to the night. The investigation into Stokes was ongoing. The final evaluation was still ahead. Nothing had been resolved yet, but something had changed. Kikoa could feel it in the way Whitford sat beside her as an ally instead of an obstacle. In the way Okonjo looked at her, like she had given him permission to believe in himself. In the way Delacroix shared his coffee and his quiet respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Stokes would not surrender his position without a fight. The system that had protected him for 18 months would not crumble easily. She would have to stand before people who had power over her career and tell truths that some of them did not want to hear. But tonight, she was not alone. Tonight, she had people who would stand beside her. And that was something the swamp could not take away. The base commander called a formation at 0600. Colonel Marcus Webb was a man who looked like he had been carved from the same cypress wood that surrounded his installation, weathered and hard, and built to outlast anything the swamp could throw at him. He stood before the assembled candidates and cadre with an expression that gave nothing away. The investigation into recent events is ongoing, he announced. His voice carried across the formation with the practiced authority of someone who had been giving orders for 3 decades. However, selection will continue as scheduled. Final evaluation begins in 48 hours. He paused and his eyes swept the assembled faces. Master Sergeant Stokes will remain in his position until the investigation reaches its conclusion. That is not a statement about guilt or innocence. That is procedure. Kikoa felt Whitford tense beside her. Across the formation, she could see Stokes standing with the other instructors, his face as unreadable as ever. But something was different now. The certainty that had always radiated from him like heat from asphalt had developed cracks. He looked like a man who knew the ground beneath him was no longer stable. The colonel continued. Final evaluation parameters have been established. Extended navigation. Team problem solving. Physical endurance. The exercise will culminate in a nighttime water crossing through Grid Section 7. Grid Section 7. The same area where Kikoa had pulled Whitford and Okonjo from the sinkhole. The same ground that had nearly killed all 3 of them. She understood immediately what this meant. Stokes had chosen the location. Psychological warfare, dressed up as training. Dismissed, the colonel said. The formation broke apart, and candidates scattered toward preparation tasks. Kikoa remained still for a moment, processing. Whitford appeared at her shoulder. He is trying to break you, Whitford said quietly, sending you back into that water, making you relive it. I know. Is it going to work? She turned to look at him, the man who had dismissed her as a quota 3 days ago, the man whose life she had saved, the man who was now standing beside her like a wall against whatever came next. No, she said. It is not going to work. They spent the next 2 days preparing. Physical conditioning, equipment checks, route planning. The mechanics of selection were familiar territory, but everything felt different now. Heavier, more consequential. This was not just about earning a place in special operations anymore. This was about proving that the system could not break people who refused to be broken. Okonjo trained alongside them with a focus that had replaced his earlier anxiety. The swamp had tried to kill him, and he had survived. That knowledge had changed something fundamental in how he carried himself. He moved differently now, spoke differently. The nervous specialist who had arrived at Fort Recluse was being replaced by something harder and more certain. The night before the final evaluation, they gathered behind the barracks one last time. The swamp was quiet in the way it sometimes got before storms, the usual chorus of life subdued into an expectant hush. Kikoa sat on her equipment crate and looked at the 2 men who had become her team. Okonjo spoke first. How do you do it? He asked. Stay calm when everything is trying to kill you. In the water test, in the bog, you never seem afraid. Kikoa considered the question. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her father's photograph. The edges were worn soft from years of handling, but his face was still clear. Strong features, steady eyes, the quiet confidence of a man who had known exactly who he was. "My grandfather taught me to dive in Hawaii," she said. "Caves where the water was black and the currents could pin you against rock if you panicked. He used to say that fear is just information. It tells you the situation is serious, but it does not get to decide what you do about it." She looked at the photograph for a long moment. My father understood that too. He was special forces. Spent his career going into places that would terrify most people. She paused. "He died in a training accident when I was 12. Equipment failure during a water insertion. By the time help arrived, it was too late." Whitford and Okonjo were silent. The weight of what she was sharing settled over them, like the humidity. "I used to think he died because he was not careful enough," she continued. "That if he had just followed protocol, checked his gear one more time, he would have come home." She shook her head. "But that is not what happened. He did everything right. Sometimes the equipment fails anyway. Sometimes the situation is impossible. What matters is what you do in the moment when everything goes wrong." She tucked the photograph away. "Tomorrow we go back into grid section 7. Back into the water where you almost died. Stokes chose that location because he thinks it will break us. He thinks the fear of what happened will make us hesitate. Make us fail." "Will it?" Okonjo asked. Kikoa looked at him, then at Whitford. These men who had gone from strangers to skeptics to allies to something that felt like family, all in the space of a week. "No," she said, "because we have already survived the worst thing that ground could do to us. We know what is in that water now. We know what it takes to come out the other side. That is not weakness. That is information." Whitford nodded slowly. He had the expression of a man who was hearing something he needed to hear. "And Stokes," he asked, "what do we do about him?" "We complete the evaluation," Kikoa said. "We prove that his games cannot stop us. And when it is over, we tell the truth about what he has done. All of it. To anyone who will listen." The swamp chose that moment to break its silence. Somewhere in the darkness an owl called out, sharp and clear, and the night insects resumed their endless conversation. Tomorrow would bring the final test. Tomorrow would bring the water that had nearly killed them and the man who wanted them to fail. But tonight, they were ready. Tonight, they knew exactly what they were walking into. And that made all the difference. Dawn broke gray and heavy, the sky pressing down on the swamp like it was trying to suffocate the land beneath it. Kikoa stood in formation with the other remaining candidates, 17 soldiers who had survived everything Fort Recluse had thrown at them and were now facing the final test. The air tasted like rain that had not yet decided to fall. Stokes walked the line with a clipboard, checking equipment and marking names. When he reached Kikoa, his steps slowed, but he did not speak. He simply looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then continued down the formation. The silence said everything his words did not. The first phase was extended navigation. 12 kilometers through terrain that punished every mistake. Kikoa led her team with the same natural skill she had demonstrated throughout selection, reading the swamp like a language she had spoken her entire life. They cleared checkpoints ahead of schedule. They avoided the hazards that slowed other teams. By midday, they had established a lead that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. The second phase was team problem solving. Complex scenarios that required coordination under pressure. A simulated casualty evacuation through difficult terrain. A tactical planning exercise with incomplete information. A communications challenge that tested patience as much as skill. Kikoa let Whitford and Okonjo contribute their strengths, directing without dominating, leading without ego. They performed flawlessly. The physical endurance portion began in late afternoon, a series of increasingly brutal challenges designed to break bodies that had already been pushed to their limits. Loaded carries through knee-deep water, obstacle courses that seemed designed by someone who hated human joints, a final movement to contact drill that left candidates gasping in the mud. Kikoa did not just survive. She excelled. Every evolution, every challenge, Every moment that was supposed to break her became another demonstration of what she was capable of. The other candidates noticed. Word of the Bog rescue had spread through the selection class like fire through dry grass, and now they were watching her prove that the rescue had not been luck. It had been skill. It had been will. It had been exactly who she was. Stokes watched too. She could feel his eyes tracking her through every phase, searching for weakness, waiting for the moment when she would finally crack. That moment never came. Night fell, and the final phase began. The water crossing through Grid Section 7. Candidates assembled at the edge of the black water that had nearly claimed 3 lives. The sinkhole was somewhere out there in the darkness, marked now with warning flags that had not existed a week ago. The checkpoint was on the far side, maybe 200 meters through terrain that wanted nothing more than to swallow anyone foolish enough to enter it. Stokes addressed them from the bank. "This is the culmination of everything you have trained for," he said. His voice carried across the water like something cold. Navigación. Endurance. The ability to perform when conditions are against you. He paused, and his eyes found Kikoa in the darkness. "Some of you have already faced this ground. You know what it can do. The question is whether you can face it again." Teams entered the water one at a time. Kikoa's team was 4th in the rotation. She stood at the edge of the swamp and looked out at the darkness that waited for her. Somewhere beneath that black surface was the mud that had tried to kill Whitford and Okonjo. Somewhere in her memory was the feeling of plunging her hand into that muck and pulling a drowning man back to life. She was not afraid. She had already given this ground everything it could take from her, and she had won. They entered the water together. Whitford on her left, Okonjo on her right, moving in formation through chest-deep swamp that fought them with every step. The darkness was absolute. The only navigation was by feel and instinct and the training that had been carved into their bodies over the past week. They were halfway across when Stokes appeared on the bank behind them. His voice cut through the night like a blade. "Hold position." The 3 of them stopped, treading water, waiting. Kikoa felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the temperature of the swamp. Stokes walked to the water's edge. Due to safety concerns raised by recent events, he announced, "Female candidates will complete a modified route for the water crossing." He pointed to the left, where the swamp curved around in a path that was clearly shorter and shallower. The modified route reduces risk while still allowing completion of the evaluation. Kikoa understood immediately. This was not about safety. This was about creating a different standard. If she took the modified route, she would technically pass the evaluation, but everyone would know she had not completed the same test as the men. It would follow her for the rest of her career. Every accomplishment would have an asterisk beside it. Every achievement would come with whispered questions about whether she had really earned it. She thought about the 3 women who had come before her. The ones who had washed out under Stokes. The ones whose equipment had failed and whose safety had been questioned. She thought about every woman who would come after her and what it would mean if she accepted a different standard now. "Staff Sergeant Kikoa," Stokes called. "Your modified route is marked. You may proceed." She stood in the chest-deep water with her rifle raised above her head. Whitford and Okonjo were motionless beside her, waiting to see what she would do. The other candidates on the bank had stopped to watch. Even the swamp seemed to hold its breath. "Negative, Master Sergeant." Her voice carried across the water without wavering. "I complete the standard route." "That is an order, Staff Sergeant." "With respect, Master Sergeant, it is an unlawful order." Captain Bassett established equal evaluation protocols for all candidates regardless of gender, unless you are documenting this as an official modification to selection policy. The silence that followed was absolute. Stokes stood on the bank with an expression that had finally cracked open, revealing something ugly underneath. Desperation. The understanding that he was losing control of a situation he had dominated for years. "Continue standard evaluation." Delacroix's voice came from somewhere in the darkness. His tone left no room for argument. "All candidates complete the same route." Kikoa turned back toward the far bank and started moving. Whitford and Okonjo moved with her. Behind them, Stokes stood alone on the shore, watching his authority dissolve into the Louisiana night. The water crossing took 47 minutes. 47 minutes of navigating black water in total darkness, feeling for stable ground with every step, maintaining formation with teammates she could barely see. The sinkhole that had nearly killed them was somewhere to their right, marked by flags that were invisible in the night. Keikoa led them around it by memory and instinct, her internal map of this terrain more reliable than any compass could have been. They emerged on the far bank with the fastest time of any team in the evaluation. Delacroix was waiting at the checkpoint. He marked their completion without ceremony, but his eyes met Keikoa's for a moment, and she saw something there that looked like pride. Behind him, other instructors were clustered in conversation, their voices too low to hear, but their body language speaking volumes. Something was happening, something beyond the normal conclusion of a selection exercise. The remaining teams completed the crossing over the next hour. When the last candidate had been accounted for, Colonel Webb appeared at the checkpoint with Captain Bassett beside him. The colonel's face was carved from the same unreadable stone it always was, but Bassett's expression held something different. Anticipation, the look of someone who knew that events were about to shift in a significant direction. All candidates and cadre will assemble at the main compound, Webb announced. Immediately, they marched back through the swamp in silence. Keikoa walked between Whitford and Okonjo, their shoulders occasionally brushing in the darkness. No words were necessary. They had survived the water together. They had refused to be separated by someone who wanted them to fail. Whatever came next, they would face it the same way. The main compound was lit with harsh overhead lights that turned the assembled faces into masks of shadow and brightness. Candidates stood in formation. Instructors lined the edges. Stokes was present, but standing apart from the others, his isolation more pronounced than it had been even hours earlier. Colonel Webb stepped forward. He held a folder that Keikoa recognized, the same folder Bassett had shown her after the bog rescue. This selection course operates on principles of fairness and equal evaluation, Webb began. His voice carried the weight of official pronouncement. Every candidate who enters this program deserves to be judged on their performance alone, not their gender, not their background, not the preferences of individual instructors. He opened the folder. Over the past 72 hours, an investigation has been conducted into allegations of systematic interference with candidate equipment and evaluation standards. Multiple witnesses have provided testimony. Physical evidence has been examined. Patterns have been documented. Keikoa did not look at Stokes. She did not need to. She could feel the tension radiating from his position like heat from a fire. The investigation has concluded that Master Sergeant Virgil Stokes engaged in deliberate sabotage of candidate equipment on at least 4 occasions over the past 18 months. Webb's voice did not waver. He created unsafe conditions designed to force specific candidates to withdraw. He abused his position to impose different standards on candidates based on gender rather than performance. The compound was absolutely silent. Even the swamp seemed to be listening. Master Sergeant Stokes, Webb continued, you are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will be escorted from this installation pending formal review and potential court-martial proceedings. 2 military police officers stepped forward from the shadows. They moved towards Stokes with the practiced efficiency of people who had performed this duty before. Stokes did not resist. He did not protest. He simply stood there as they reached him, his face finally showing something that Keikoa had never seen from him before: defeat. But before they led him away, he turned and looked directly at her. The mask was gone entirely now. What remained was something complicated. Anger, yes. Resentment. But underneath those familiar emotions was something else. Something that looked almost like grief. My sister, he said. His voice was quiet enough that only those nearest could hear. She was in the Army too. Transportation Corps. She died in a vehicle accident during her second deployment. He paused. I thought I was protecting people like her. I thought I was keeping them safe from situations they were not built to handle. Keikoa met his eyes. She saw the broken logic that had driven him, the loss that had curdled into something toxic, the genuine belief, twisted beyond recognition, that what he was doing was right. Your sister did not need protection, she said. She needed the same chance everyone else got, the chance to prove what she was capable of. Something shifted in his face. Not acceptance, not forgiveness, but perhaps the first crack in a belief system that had sustained him through years of sabotage and manipulation. The MPs led him away. The compound watched in silence as he disappeared into the Louisiana night. 18 years of special operations service ending in disgrace because he could not accept that the world was bigger than his grief. Colonel Webb waited until Stokes was gone before speaking again. Selection results will be announced at 0800 tomorrow. He looked at the assembled candidates with something that might have been respect. You have all performed admirably under difficult circumstances. Whatever happens tomorrow, you should be proud of what you have accomplished here. The formation was dismissed. Candidates scattered toward barracks and rest, and the processing of everything that had just occurred. Kikoa remained still for a moment, looking at the spot where Stokes had stood. Whitford appeared beside her. "How do you feel?" he asked. She considered the question. The man who had tried to destroy her career was gone. The system that had protected him had finally been held accountable. Justice had been served in the official sense of the word. But she also remembered the grief in his eyes when he spoke about his sister. The broken love that had become something monstrous. "I feel like it is not over," she said. "The investigation is done. The evaluation is done. But the reasons people like him exist in the first place, those are not going anywhere." Whitford nodded slowly. "Then we keep going," he said. "We keep proving them wrong. One mission at a time." She looked at him, at this man who had become her ally, her teammate, her friend. "One mission at a time," she agreed. The hours before dawn moved slowly. Kikoa lay on her bunk and listened to the sounds of the barracks around her. The breathing of exhausted candidates. The occasional shift of weight on creaking frames. The distant chorus of the swamp that had become so familiar it now felt like silence. She did not sleep. Her mind was too full of everything that had happened and everything that might happen when the sun rose. Selection results would determine the trajectory of her entire career. Success meant joining the ranks of special operations, becoming one of the first women to complete this particular course. Failure meant returning to her previous unit with nothing but experience and the knowledge that she had come close. But as she lay there in the darkness, she realized that the outcome mattered less than she had expected. Whatever the results said, she knew what she had done. She had navigated terrain that should have killed her. She had saved 2 lives when protocol said to walk away. She had stood against a system designed to break her and refused to bend. No piece of paper could take that away. Okonjo found her outside the barracks as the first gray light began to separate the sky from the tree line. He was holding 2 cups of coffee, steam rising into the humid air. She accepted one without speaking, and they stood together watching the swamp wake up. "I called my mother again last night," he said eventually. "Told her everything. The rescue. The investigation. What happens today?" He paused, and something soft moved across his face. "She said she has been praying for me every day since I left Detroit. She said she knew God had a plan for me, even when I could not see it." Kikoa sipped her coffee. "Do you believe that?" she asked. "That there is a plan?" Okonjo considered the question. "I believe that I'm standing here right now," he said. "A week ago, I was a scared kid from Detroit who thought the swamp was going to kill him. Now I am someone who survived that swamp, who was saved by someone who did not have to save me, who might actually become something." He looked at her. "If that is not a plan, I do not know what is." Whitford joined them a few minutes later. He looked like he had not slept either, but there was a settled quality to his exhaustion. The peace of someone who had made decisions and was ready to live with the consequences. "Whatever happens today," he said without preamble, "I need you both to know something." He faced Kikoa directly. "I have served with a lot of soldiers. Rangers. Special forces. People who are supposed to be the best of the best. You're the finest soldier I have ever worked with. Gender has nothing to do with it. Background has nothing to do with it. You are simply exceptional. Coming from Damon Whitford, the words carried weight that 1,000 official commendations could not match. Kikoa felt something warm spread through her chest despite the morning chill. "Thank you," she said, "for saying that, and for being willing to see it." He nodded once. Then his expression shifted into something that almost resembled a smile. "Besides," he added, "I still owe you my life. Pretty sure that means I have to say nice things about you forever. It is in the regulations somewhere." Okonjo laughed. The sound broke the tension that had been building since they woke, releasing something that all three of them had been holding too tightly. They walked to the formation together as the sun cleared the tree line. The compound was already filling with candidates and cadre, everyone drawn by the gravity of what was about to happen. Colonel Webb stood at the front with a clipboard that held the names of those who had passed. Beside him, Captain Bassett and Delacroix waited with expressions that revealed nothing. The formation assembled. 17 candidates standing at attention, waiting to learn whether the worst week of their lives had been worth it. The swamp stretched out behind them, patient and eternal, indifferent to human ambitions and fears. Webb stepped forward. "This election course is designed to identify individuals capable of performing at the highest levels under the most demanding conditions," he began. His voice carried across the silent compound. "The evaluation process is rigorous. The standards are absolute. Not everyone who enters this program will complete it. That is by design." He looked down at his clipboard. "The following candidates have successfully completed all requirements for selection." The names came one at a time. Each one a life changed. Each one a future redirected. Sergeant First Class Damon Whitford. Whitford's exhale was barely audible, but Kikoa heard it. She felt him straighten slightly beside her, the relief flowing through his body like electricity. Specialist Terrence Okonjo. Okonjo made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. His shoulders shook once, and then he was still again, standing at attention with tears running freely down his face. He did not wipe them away. He had earned those tears. More names followed. Candidates who had survived the swamp and the pressure and their own limitations. Each name was a small victory against everything that had tried to stop them. Then Webb paused. The silence stretched long enough that Kikoa felt her heartbeat in her throat. Staff Sergeant Yolanda Kikoa. The world did not change. The swamp did not applaud. The sun continued its slow climb above the cypress trees. But something shifted inside her chest. A lock opening. A weight releasing. The understanding that she had done something that could never be undone. She was the first woman to complete this selection course. Not because of different standards or modified routes or special accommodations. Because she had met every requirement that had ever been demanded of any candidate and exceeded most of them. Beside her, Whitford's hand brushed against hers. A brief contact that said everything words could not. Okonjo was still crying silently, his smile so wide it looked like it might break his face. Kikoa stood at attention and let the moment wash over her. Her father's photograph was in her pocket, pressed against her heart. She hoped he could see this. She hoped he knew that his daughter had finally proven what she had always believed, that she was enough, that she had always been enough. The celebration that followed was unlike anything the selection course had seen before. Candidates who had spent a week treating each other as competition suddenly became something closer to family, bound by shared suffering and collective triumph. Someone produced a contraband bottle of whiskey that made its way around the barracks in small measured sips. Stories were traded. Laughter echoed off walls that had witnessed nothing but exhaustion for days. Kikoa stood apart from the celebration for a moment, watching her fellow selectees from the doorway of the barracks. These men who had doubted her and dismissed her and ultimately fought beside her. She had arrived at Fort Recluse expecting to prove something. She was leaving with something far more valuable. The knowledge that proof was not the point. Performance was the point. Being exactly who she was in the moments that demanded everything. Delacroix found her there. He moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating uncertain ground, and he carried 2 bottles of water instead of whiskey. "Thought you might prefer this," he said, handing her one. The bayou teaches you that hydration matters more than celebration. She accepted the water with a small smile. Thank you. For everything. Not just this. He nodded slowly, his weathered face holding the weight of things he chose not to say aloud. There's a word in old Cajun stories, he said. For people like you. The ones who respect the water and earn its respect in return. He paused. Survivant. It means more than just someone who survives. It means someone who understands that survival is a conversation, not a conquest. Kikoa turned the word over in her mind. Survivant. It felt right. It felt like something her grandfather would have understood. The swamp will remember what you did here, Delacroix continued. The ground where you pulled those men out. That place has a different meaning now. It is not just where people almost died. It is where someone refused to let them. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that felt like benediction, then walked away into the Louisiana evening. The next morning brought departure. Buses arrived to transport selectees to their next assignments, carrying them away from the swamp that had tried so hard to break them. Kikoa stood with her duffel bag and watched the other candidates load their gear, saying goodbyes that felt both premature and overdue. Whitford approached her last. He had a piece of paper in his hand that he held out without explanation. Valor recommendation, he said, for the bog rescue. I submitted it last night with Okonjo as co-signer. Command fast-tracked it given the circumstances. He paused. You should know that what you did is going to be recognized officially. Not just here, everywhere. Kikoa looked at the paper. The formal language of military commendation reduced her actions to bullet points and timestamps. But underneath the bureaucratic prose was something real. Evidence that what had happened in that swamp would not be forgotten. You did not have to do this, she said. Whitford shook his head. Yes, I did. Because people need to know, not just that you saved us, but how you saved us. Walking into ground that should have killed you. Keeping your weapon raised while you pulled us out. He met her eyes. That is the kind of soldier people need to hear about. The kind that makes the next woman think maybe she could do it too. They shook hands. Then, in a gesture that surprised them both, Whitford pulled her into a brief embrace. The kind of hug that soldiers share when words are not sufficient for what needs to be communicated. Stay dangerous, Kikoa, he said as he stepped back. She smiled. Stay humble, Whitford. Okonjo's goodbye was simpler and more emotional. He hugged her without hesitation and held on for a long moment, his voice thick when he finally spoke. My mother wants to meet you, he said. She told me to tell you that you are part of our family now. That saving her son means she owes you everything she has. Tell her she does not owe me anything, Kikoa replied. Just tell her that her son is going to make her proud. That is payment enough. He wiped his eyes and nodded. Then he was gone, climbing onto a bus that would carry him toward a future he had not believed possible 2 weeks earlier. Kikoa was the last aboard. She paused at the door of the bus and looked back at Fort Recluse one final time. The swamp stretched out beyond the compound, ancient and indifferent, and somehow beautiful in the morning light. Somewhere out, there was the ground that had tried to swallow 3 people whole. Somewhere out, there was the water that had nearly claimed lives and instead had witnessed something extraordinary. She thought about her father, about his photograph still pressed against her heart, about the conversation she had been having with his memory for 17 years. I understand now, Dad, she said silently. Why you kept going, why you pushed so hard. It was never about proving anything. It was about becoming someone who could be there when it mattered. She climbed onto the bus and found a seat by the window. The engine rumbled to life and Fort Recluse began to shrink in the distance, becoming first a collection of buildings, then a smudge against the tree line, then nothing but memory. The airport was crowded with travelers who had no idea what she had just accomplished. Kikoa moved through the terminal with her duffel bag and her new unit patch and the quiet confidence of someone who had been tested by something most people could not imagine. She was waiting at her gate when she noticed the young woman, early 20s, wearing a uniform that was still crisp enough to announce recent basic training completion. The young woman was staring at Kikoa's patch with an expression that held recognition and something else. Wonder. The particular wonder of someone seeing proof that impossible things might actually be possible. Their eyes met. Kikoa gave her a slight nod. Just an acknowledgement. Just a moment of connection between two women in a world that often told them they did not belong. The young woman straightened. Something shifted in her posture. Her shoulders pulled back and her chin lifted, and she looked like someone who had just been given permission to believe in herself. Kikoa smiled and turned toward her gate. The next chapter was waiting. The next mission. The next opportunity to prove that the bog did not care who you were. It only cared what you could do. And Yolanda Kikoa could do anything. If this story moved you, drop a comment and tell us what resonated most. Maybe you have witnessed this kind of courage yourself, or maybe you know someone who refused to quit when everything was against them. Share your story. We would love to hear it.